Just to give you a little bit of introduction about who we are. So Zaloni is a data lake software company. So we focus on getting enterprise-wide data lakes available for customers from a data management and data governance standpoint in a short time, right? So how do we have an integrated platform that brings value so that you can quickly build your analytical use cases and have business impact? So, and then we help our customers with our professional services in order to architect, design, and implement those data lakes. And then we have packaged some solutions for specific offerings that we bring to the market as well. So before we jump into the architecture of the data lake, so let's talk a little bit about the context and what we're seeing in the marketplace. So as our customers in various different verticals are going through digital transformation initiatives or becoming an analytical-driven organization, a modern data platform is a fundamental requirement. And when I say a modern data platform, it needs to be a data platform that scales, that provides the agility, and that has the flexibility so that you can get new insights quickly across many different data sets that you weren't able to onboard into a single unified repository before. So that's kind of the high-level context that why companies are moving towards data lake environments. Some of the common recurring use cases that we see are driven from an efficiency standpoint, where it is augmentation of the data warehouse, where you're providing data lake as a service to different lines of businesses, or where you may be using the data lake for some compliance and regulatory requirements. So we see some of the new and emerging use cases in financial services, GDPR, and other things also fit well with data lake architectures. And then we see net new greenfield type of use cases. So this is where you're able to use data as an asset to drive new revenue streams, to provide better experience to your customers and things like that. So this is where advanced analytics so that you can map your customer's journey, being able to monetize the data from a use case perspective so that you're generating net new revenue streams, and then also having a 360 view of your customer or your product and things like that. So we are seeing a fundamental shift from a traditional way of doing things in the data space to what we call a modern data architecture. And this is kind of a slide that summarizes what that looks like. So from our point of view, so you had like your traditional data sources, you would go through an extensive ETL process, and then you'll create your data marts, and then you'll provide your BI or analytics capability. So what we're seeing is a shift to what we call the modern data architecture, where you're able to bring in many different data sources, not just the traditional relational data sets that you were used to in a traditional environment. You're able to bring in data in a streaming manner. You're able to bring in structured and unstructured data into a single unified repository, and then run various workloads in this repository to serve different use cases. So some of them could be to support your legacy reporting, which could still be based out of your data warehouse. And that is where you see that arrow going to the EDW, where the heavy lifting is done in the data lake, but you may be still populating the data marts in the EDW because your legacy applications are running off of the EDW. So we see that more of an augmentation use case. But what we also see is more and more the new use cases can be done directly and natively on top of the data lake. So that's kind of the bottom arrow, if you will. So before we go into the specific details on the architecture, this is a chart that we like to walk through as we talk to different customers to understand where they are at with this data lake journey, right? So on the left-hand side, on the leftmost column, you have those folks who are still in the traditional data platforms. So we call that the ignore stage. But then we have many customers that we're working with where they have gone through this exercise where they have onboarded Hadoop and big data ecosystems, and they used it as just a data store without the proper management and governance around it. And that may work well for one or two use cases, but when you try to scale it up across the enterprise with different lines of businesses coming on board, that is where the challenge is. And so we call that the data swamp. And then moving forward, and this is where we come in and play a role, is how do you create a governed and managed data lake with proper metadata, with proper data quality, with all the security and access controls that you need on top of the data, so that it's not just for one or two use cases, you can scale it out across different lines of businesses with different users having different role-based access control and things like that. But it's all driven based on a foundation of metadata, and that is kind of how we think about building these data lake environments. And then going forward, being able to automate some of these pipelines so that, let's say, if you have ingested data from mainframe systems once, how do you use these pipelines in a repeatable way, in a reusable way, so that you can quickly enable more use cases in this agile data platform. And then if you look at further on the right-hand side, that is where we think about optimize, which is where using some of the machine learning and analytics techniques on the data itself from a data management, data governance perspective, being able to add value, because now you have the data in the data lake. How can you use some of the compute power to be able to do these things and make recommendations about the data, or may be able to do deduplication of the data? And we'll talk about that in a later slide on something that we just announced earlier today. So that's kind of the journey that we think about, and we like to think that customers should be starting from the governed and going forward, so that you're not creating some of the problems of building a data swamp with a proper data management and data governance layer. So this is how we think about it. It's a complex ecosystem, as you can see. It involves the whole stack, whether your infrastructure, whether it's deployed on-prem or in the cloud. Then you need to think about different types of storage you want to support. We were having a discussion earlier today about the concept of this data fabric, which includes not just the Hadoop file system, but also other things that could be part of this logical data lake or the logical data warehouse. So it could be a block file system, which is HDFS. We're seeing an increasing adoption of object stores as customers are considering cloud options with different object stores that are available. And then also what relational databases or NoSQL databases could be part of that ecosystem. And then you start thinking about what does your compute layer look like. So depending on the workloads, you may, by default, you'll have batch type of workloads, but then we are seeing increasing need for micro batch, where you have much lower latency of how you process things. And then also streaming data coming in and doing in-memory analytics so that you have streaming output, so that a lot of things happen in the in-memory layer, but at the same time, you're storing the data in the data lake for historical kind of analysis and things like that. So more and more, these things are getting converged. So then what you need to think about is how do you manage all of this from a governance, stewardship, data management standpoint. And that is where we think of how do you enable the data lake with what are the different functions that are needed to build the data lake? How do you govern the data lake once you have built it? And then how do you engage with your line of business users? Because ultimately, it's about the business impact and the business value, right? So you need to think about how do you enable some of the self-service functions so that your line of business users are able to do things themselves without having to go to IT every single time. So what does that look like? So we think about all the different data sources that needs to be ingested. And so if you think about this as a supply chain of data, so you have the data producers on one side, you have the data consumers on the other side. And so what does the supply chain of data look like in a data lake? So you think about, on the enabled side, how do you ingest data from batch sources or from streaming sources? How do you auto-discover some of the structure and the format of the data as you're bringing in so that you're able to capture this metadata in an ongoing basis. Metadata is like a central function of this data lake. So you need to think about what does that layer look like. And it's not just about the technical metadata. You need to think about your business and operational metadata that you should capture as part of building the data lake. But then in most of the use cases, we see privacy and security as one of the key requirements. So it may start all the way from having your storage layer encrypted to kind of having a cluster that is Kerberized to individual attributes that needs to be masked and tokenized based on their sensitivity. So you need to think along the lines of how do you enforce that? How do you define role-based access control on your data sets so that certain line of business users have only access to certain data sets and not others? So those things needs to come into play because ultimately you're building a multi-tenant data lake even though it's deployed within the enterprise. And then we think about data lifecycle management because not all data is of the same value. So how do you provide policy-based lifecycle and enforce that? And then data quality. This is often an ignored topic, but it is an important one. Otherwise, it's garbage in, garbage out. So once you think about the governance functions, then we think about like what are the functions that enable this data lake to be more acceptable or usable by the business users. And that's where a rich catalog with self-service data preparation functions, where you can then quickly operationalize them, is important. So let's look at some of these things and in a little bit more details. So, I mean, this is another view of that chart. So at the core is the metadata management layer, and then you have the enable, govern, and engage functions with the different features that I talked about. So one of the important aspects to think about as you build this enterprise-wide data lake is also a concept of different zones. So you may want to keep your data from the source systems in a raw zone in its original format, and then have a set of processes that certifies or validates the data and creates data sets in the trusted zone. So this may be done by data stewards or by a centralized data authority where they have defined these validation rules or certification rules so that whatever is in the trusted zone has gone through that process and can be used enterprise-wide. And then we think about the refined zone, which is where certain enrichments or aggregations may be done and you're creating use case level derived data sets that you're populating. But you're making it consumable so that rest of the organization can also use these same data sets so that you can avoid data duplication. And then one of the essential elements is having a sandbox area so that your ad hoc exploratory use cases can be performed there, right? So if you have data scientist who wants to try to play with the data to build a model, so they have access to this, or they can self-provision a sandbox area and be able to do these functions. So just to kind of drill down into a little bit of each of the areas. So data governance, from our perspective, needs to be a hybrid approach. So it's not just a top-down approach, it also needs to be a bottom-up approach, which means that there are critical data elements across the organization that needs to be tightly governed, but you also need to be able to have data consumers participate in a crowdsourced manner in the governance model where they can rate and rank data sets, they can annotate and tag so that others can use that value. So this is a slide from the Gartner Data and Analytics Conference in terms of how they think a governance model should be defined as you deploy these modern data platforms. So the inner circle is the most tightly governed data that is, say, controlled by a CDO's office. Then the circle beyond that is a line of business specific data that may be governed within that line of business. And then the outermost circle is localized data where you're bringing in your own data sets and is very loosely governed, right? So think about it from that perspective. So this is how we think about ingestion. It needs to be thought at scale, what that looks like. And as you ingest the data, being able to capture some of these operational statistics so that you can create these data pipelines and you can monitor these data pipelines is important. And when you think about ingestion, it's not just the batch ingestion or ingestion from relational databases, but it's also streaming ingestion and various types of files that we see need to be brought into the data lake. Lineage is another key area. So as you bring in the data and you transform the data in the data lake, being able to capture those changes, who made the changes, when it was made, so that you can do impact analysis and other features is an important requirement. Then we think about data quality as where you are able to define a set of rules at the metadata level, but then you're able to create these data pipelines that include data quality as part of post-ingestion processing so that you can validate the data before you make it consumable. We see a lot of third-party data, as well as, let's say, for IoT and sensor data sets coming in, there may be a lot of junk data there, right? So you want to be able to separate good records from bad records and make it available. And then quickly going through some of the other features, data lifecycle management is another one that we think is an important requirement for the data lake. So we think about being able to define a data lifecycle management policy because not all data may be of equal value over a period of time, and these data lake environments grow. So you may want to keep some of the data in your hot zone, age it out, and move it to a warm zone, and after some period of time, put it in an archive zone so you can kind of tier your storage and get some of the economies of scale. And then having a rich catalog as you have built your platform, as you have captured the metadata, as you have applied these governance rules, so that now you're bringing this to the end users and showing them what data sets exist, what are the attributes of these data sets, and then allowing them to have self-service data preparation functions or self-service data provisioning from a sandbox creation. So the last slide I have before I switch it over to Carlos is one of the things that we just released recently, we announced it today, is now that you have the data lake in place, we see that you can add value on top of the data lake. And one of the use cases that we have worked on is how do you master the data? So you may have a lot of duplicate data and you want to create the golden record for your customer. So being able to go through the pipeline and then having a machine learning-based approach to be able to master the data is an important aspect that we see. So we have taken some of the work that we had done earlier and integrated into what we call the matching engine, which can allow you to create blocks of data and then be able to run some of the classification algorithms on top of the data to create the single golden copy or single golden record for your customer or product or whatever, with a match and merge type of algorithm. So with that, I'll switch it over to Carlos. Carlos, please take it over.
Hello. So my group within AIG provides a shared service across the entire enterprise. So we have a small and growing data portfolio. So a number of technologies we manage, things like Hadoop and Talend and IBM InfoSphere and many others. Our core activities that we perform is technology evaluation. So we help with a review against use cases, against the marketplace to see what types of technologies can suit that specific need. Consulting, we do quite a bit of, so understanding, going through a design of sorts, but also just helping with development of that idea into some practical technologies and patterns that would support the business needs. Delivery, so we're kind of a jack of all trades. So we do a bit of development, so we'll be hands-on keyboard development. We also provide those structured platforms for management by the organizations. And then on the management side, we take care of the typical things that I think everyone really hates, is all those operational practices and making sure we have incident support and whatnot. But we provide full service management of all of the portfolios or number of applications and platforms that we have underneath our portfolio. So our challenges is probably similar to many of yours. So I'm just curious, how many people for their companies have like more than 5,000 people in your whole organization? Okay, that's a good set of folks in the group. So my challenges probably you're going to be nodding your head. We've been coming from an area of, I think Ben had it listed as ignore phase.
Yeah.
So we were kind of in the denial phase. So going into an enlightened phase. So we came from an antiquated or an aging portfolio with just thousands and thousands of applications, thousands of databases, geographically dispersed, whether it be Europe, Asia Pac, within the United States, and different lines of business, and really, I'll say, diversified suite of different activities and applications we had. Our challenges have been the lack of anything that congeals everything together. So the semantic models, the ontology models, and others, we just didn't have a real good, a well-defined taxonomy. Quality issues, challenges against things like source of truth for the content, and many people making decisions against their definition of the right answer against content. And our opportunity, obviously, is to try to power those digital experiences with the data that we have, trying to then understand and facilitate governance in a more structured way. Seems about to fall apart. So 2015, at least I understand where we came from, and this is just within the last couple of years, but we're dealing in dog years in this world, so I think everyone will appreciate it. So we coming from our multi-distributed type of environment, a lot of many warehouses, a lot of data marts, a lot of solution stacks, a lot of Excel spreadsheets within our environment. Today, there's just a huge number of activities that are happening right now around rationalization of our applications, our databases, the tool suites that we have, and we have a huge amount of work that's happening around data analytics, innovation. We're now starting to carry, within AIG, carry policies for things like drones. We're starting to ingest a lot of real-time data from sensors into our systems. And it's really, it's starting to push our direction or our capabilities into ways that we really haven't really envisioned or hasn't really created a framework yet to support, but that's what we've been building. And then the future, obviously, is when everything comes together and we can have a much more well-orchestrated organization against the data that we have. Things like, again, single source of truth, and having a rational data environment. So we know the data lake would be used for one thing. You have data marts to be used for another, or visualization suites and others. Our drivers within AIG primarily have been against the top. So things like the single view of everything, whether it be product, producer, whether it be consumer, those or customer, those tend to be the highlights of most of the conversations I'm probably in. Predictive analytics, absolutely, is a cornerstone at this point, and just about every technology under the sun is discussed these days, but we're trying to rationalize that a bit better. Data discovery in probably a few different parts, understanding the type of data, the tagging, mapping, the association to business owner, also having some more metadata against the data that we have for understanding the life cycle and the refresh cycle and where it inherits content from. So all those kind of activities are happening right now, but and as well as optimizing our data technologies overall. The types of data, I think I mentioned it's a growing set of content, and we assume that there'll be some changes coming into the future. Some of the aspects around unstructured tend to be a focus, or let's say a great area of opportunity for us for harvesting content. So things like adjusters notes and others tend to be a big area of opportunity that we're leveraging solutions today. So our overall approach, most of the organization, you can see it in two parts. There's been this regulatory approach, so things like you have to have defined reporting going external to regulators and whatnot. That's more defensive, so what you need to do to just have sustaining operations. But in order to go towards more the innovator, or in this case, offensive mode, and now you're starting to build new products, new capabilities, that is hinged on our ability of being able to have, to harvest the content that we have and really place it into an area that we can leverage across the organization. So on the right-hand side, it touches some of those aspects of it. So our science organizations need the content for general use case analytics, especially a lot of things that are happening on the predictive side, digital experiences, so making sure we can have common customer masters. So when you start building these applications, they have to hook into a unified contact or customer list against what products that they have. And all this is an area that we're working on, but I'd say that most of the organization up until probably a couple of years ago has been more defensive based. And even though we had some glimmers of offensive, now we are very much on this innovator digital side that's driving the organization or our patterns. But data being the key, having the content available is something that is a targeted function within AIG. To highlight those benefits of what a data lake would represent, so things like data marketplace in this case being able to expose out the data assets that we do have, so people can then choose, select, as opposed to build, create on their own against things like data warehouses and others. A single view says customer, but really single view of everything. It just depends on what dimension you're really looking at. That's important. And then on the innovation side, we're really getting into those really fun things around machine learning, and that's being used in operational models, trying to automate some of our business practices as well. And then overall technology innovation is starting to push maybe pull the carpet out from underneath us on how we're establishing ourselves as a capability. We're being very nimble, very agile these days, even more so than even I thought a couple years ago, which is amazing. So to kind of give another representation of what an enterprise ecosystem looks like, and this is a relatively good representation of the bits and pieces that surround us for how things connect. You have a lot of the data that's coming inbound for data ingestion. The data lake is one aspect, but it's not the entire environment. I mean, you can use terms like ecosystems and fabrics and others, but the data lake is one part, and you really have to be smart against what the data lake is good for, things like what our data warehouse is good for, how you do your visualization, and you really need to architect out how these items work, including things like MDM, master data, or rather reference data. You have to be smart against these components. But this is a good representation and a pathway. I'm not going to go through the numbers, but nonetheless, a lot of data comes in. You can massage it. You can make some decisions against the big data itself within like a data lake. But those decisions could also be made externally. So things like in your traditional data warehouse stores, whether it be like Netezza or your relational systems or otherwise. Okay, data lake model, and I really have to talk to that Gartner analyst you got the other slide from, because I'm going to kill him. I shared this with these guys several times last year. So this is a good way of looking at think of a multi-tenancy within data lake, but you can also look at this as a governance model. And the way it would work, and this gets into some details that it's an eyesore at a distance from most of the people here. But like in the very center, it is your super hyper shared type of content. So if everyone agrees that you're going to have a customer master, customer model, then everyone needs to agree in that schema that you're going to store and maintain that content. That's the kind of data that would be in the middle. Third-party content that gets used universally by the organization, those kind of things would be in the middle. And you would grow that for things like business glossaries and others. Going from there, it then establishes ownerships on things like the lines of business or these business units. So the business units like in tier 1, so middle is tier 0, outside tier 1, because we always want to make the business units always number 1, so hence the tier 1. So the business units would have their own management on top of their data assets. So the way this would work is The business units would have, and probably better if I point to things like this so you can kind of visually understand it. I could probably do it here. So the business units would then govern their applications, projects, and their individual users in science. So they may have a few different applications underneath their management. And let's say those applications have a few different consumers. So there's other systems, other applications that want to use the data. Then they can certainly allow that data to be used by those other organizations. However, in the typical scenario, projects and applications, they're focused only on their timelines, their requirements, their needs. The likelihood is pretty high that they're going to make a change that's going to break something. That interface, that integration, that interoperability with other types of systems, that's a challenge. In that case, if there's really a need to have more governing controls on even that abstraction layer that's being managed, you really need to take that complexity away from the applications. In this case, the business units would then manage that interface to that data to those other sourcing applications. And similarly so for things like users in science, depends on how you're structuring your application suites. They would follow a similar guideline, but the likelihood is that pretty low for sharing within the user or the science type scenarios, and it gets much more highly curated, and also you have a lot more more exposure to cross-organizational sharing once it gets into the center. So that's a typical model. Down below just gets into more descriptions about the governance structures, what the data ownerships are, and what these functions are. But in generally, that's the concept for how data governance works in a multi-organization or sub-organization within a large enterprise, but certainly the case within AIG. So some takeaways. As we went through this journey, the major takeaways are make sure you definitely have the right sponsor. So you definitely need someone who can manage finances, but you need to understand your political structure, and you have to have someone with the right panache for being able to manage your way effectively. Establish those business outcomes and use cases. Make sure you're defining whatever you're doing against some specific business outcome, some value to the organization. Otherwise, this will just be introduced like a data lake as just a technology component. And the last thing you want to do is chase a problem with a hammer. You want to make sure you're aligning what you're doing against those needs. Define your data strategy, much like that other model. So make sure that you have an understanding of your security models and others, but you also need to understand, which I'm probably combining it with more your governance structures as well. Your technology ecosystem, again, couldn't really stress enough. The data lake or things like a Hadoop type of environment, that is it's a single component in the greater whole of all your data products, including your security, your governance solutions, MDM solutions, and others. Make sure you start your communications way early. So things like data jams, hackathons are fantastic ways of getting that point across, deliver a solution quickly for people to kind of see in reality that something works. Be active, so share, demonstrate those solutions as much as possible. Focus on just 90-day deliverables out of the gate, and make sure you're thinking through some dedicated staffing. A matrix model works, but to be really effective, try to keep that team at minimum dedicated to that program for a certain number of months right from the beginning. And since I'm co-hosting with Zaloni, and we are using Zaloni, I wanted to give you some pointers around even our selection for Zaloni. Focus on requirements. We spanned a number of different product sets when we're looking at Salone, and you have to take your typical approach. Look at your requirements. This case we went through quantitative, very kind of empirical modeling against what you're looking for, and your qualitative. How good is it? Is it bad? Strong? You're weighted more like. There's a lot of people that are in the marketplace that can probably say that they can do it. And our experience has been, especially for people like Zaloni, you really look at someone's longevity. So you have to look at their balance sheets. You really have to look at what they're doing for their customers, how long they've been around, and you really have to reach out to them to get some references. Partner with someone that's going to grow with you, so it's not just a specific need today. You really have to plan for where you're going to go, and you need someone who can help you with that mapping and be flexible for those solutions. And then, because I think our time is short, I'm just going to kind of go right to a couple of points. So make sure that they have true enterprise experience. Things like integration for Active Directory or Kerberos implementation, having those really intimate conversations with your security organizations, those are tough to get through, and you need to have someone with the experience of being able to do it. It is, and that's a big one for us. The last one is if you're interested, and this is something that we definitely valued from being able to initially bring in Zaloni, considering your support structure even for your overall data lake. So we have a Hortonworks-based environment. Hortonworks is open source, so it created some options for being able to shift some of those costs for operational management into, we're using something like Zaloni. So it offset those costs pretty significantly. And that is about it.
So I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, if there are any.
So you talked about access control, role-based access control. So do you support attribute-based access control?
Yeah, so the question is, in addition to, in the role-based access control, can it be mapped to for the granularity at the attribute level, not just at the file or the table level, right?
Attribute means like the environment attributes or something.
Okay, like based on generic policies. Yeah, so I think the way we have done role-based access control is define this concept of projects. So you can have, let's say, a customer 360 project, and customer 360 project can have different members from different groups that are participating in it, so based on users and roles. And then we define what are the access that the groups are assigned within that project, right? And then what we do is that you're defining at the data management level, and then we push it down to the data layer. So depending on whether you're using Sentry or Ranger or whatever, how does it integrate to that so that basically it's enforced at the data layer itself? So I think the challenge in this ecosystem is that there is no standardized security model, right? So everyone does their own kind of security implementation. So what we're trying to do is abstract it out so that whatever is your underlying platform, we're able to push it down from the data management layer to the data access layer. And same thing we're doing now with some of the cloud service providers with integration with IAM and things like that, so that you can protect your S3 buckets or other object stores based on that model. Yeah. Question?
What's the resource mix between AIG and Salone as far as the project and going forward?
So we've implemented. We went live in April. And if it gives you an understanding of how quick, we purchased in December, and we were production live in April. The mix is, I'd say, from a percentage standpoint, 80% AIG, 20% Zaloni. But what Zaloni helps us with is with operational support, so things like incident support, design planning, upgrade planning type of activities. They also independently also provide project delivery support to different lines of business. And I'm not equating that portion of it. The parts that we have on site are all of the the core IT administrative staff. We have some of our own development teams, but those are more SME resources. And then we handle hands-on keyboard for all of the operational tasks, whether it be a log triage or trying to upgrade the product sets.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question. Yeah.
So, you spoke about metadata, right?
Yeah.
So, any best practices or experiences you can share with us, because you spoke about ontologies and semantic models, etc. So, it's very clear that it has to be done as the data is coming into the lake.
Yeah.
Right? But in terms of actually operationalizing that in terms of tools, in terms of technology, is it something you should go with, say, custom-built solutions, or is it, how do you manage the metadata on the lake itself?
I can start with that, and please feel free to
that.
jump in. So from our perspective, it has to be an open solution because metadata is key in terms of having a healthy data lake, right? And it needs to be flexible where if you have an enterprise-wide metadata repository, let's say, you should be able to pull metadata definitions from there into the data lake so that you're not reinventing the wheel and defining it again. So having a metadata exchange framework to be able to do that is important. And then same way, if you are creating new data sets in the data lake, being able to exchange the metadata into an enterprise-wide repository is important. Ultimately, I think it needs to be something where you have full API access to any metadata that is being generated or created, but at the same time, it is being integrated with the ecosystem. So if you have HCatalog, for example, so that it is all the technical metadata is pushed down to HCatalog, so that no matter what frameworks you're using, whether it's Hive, Spark, Impala, whatever, you see the same structures that you see in the data management layer of the data lake. So that's the approach that we have taken.
Yeah, Alton, simple embellishment, which is we have Calibra externally for the organization. So we're still working, and actually KK, who's right there, put your hand up. He's been managing this implementation or quite a while, administering the whole environment, implementing the models with our data governance teams and others. But we've externalized that within AIG. When it gets into the lake, we're working together on creating that hook between Calibra and into the data lake using Zaloni. And then the other thing that we're doing is we're trying to create some better standards within the data lake so that when we bring things in, you tag it exactly the same way. We have this concept of something called D4, and D4 has really a lightweight way of at least tagging things like the geography, the business unit ownership, some other things. And we're trying to expand that a bit. But at the moment, it's not true technology enforced, so there's still more of a policy aspect to it for what people need to do to manage it. But we have the opportunity then to audit it after to make sure things are clean so that all the linkages and tags are correct. But building that whole structure and getting everything well operationalized absolutely is a challenge, and it's an evolving standard.
All right, thank you so much. And Kelly is giving out some understanding metadata books in the back, so feel free to grab one. All right, thank you, Carlos.
Thanks, sir.